October 1941. Heinrich Himmler visits Lublin. He is not there to inspect the city. He is there to meet Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police leader for the Lublin district, a man whose ambitions and brutality have already made him one of the most feared figures in occupied Poland. Globoknik has been tasked with implementing the systematic murder of the Jewish population of the general government, the German-administered territory carved out of occupied Poland. The operation that will eventually bear the code name Reinhard has not yet been formally launched, but its architecture is already taking shape in conversations between men like these. What Himmler orders during this visit is the construction of a massive concentration camp on the outskirts of Lublin. The stated purpose, at this stage, is labor. The camp is to hold prisoners of war, specifically Soviet POWs, hundreds of thousands of whom have been captured in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. It is also intended to serve as a hub for the SS's economic ambitions in the East, a vast labor reservoir to be exploited in the service of German industry and the construction projects Himmler envisions for the occupied territories. The site selected lies in the Majdanek district, southeast of the city center. It is flat, open ground, easy to develop, easy to fence, easy to guard. Construction begins in the autumn of 1941 under conditions that immediately reveal the true priorities of the SS. The prisoners assigned to build their own camp, Soviet POWs in the first instance, are given inadequate tools, inadequate food, and no shelter against the Polish winter. They die by the thousands before the first permanent structures are completed. This is the first thing to understand about Majdanek. It killed people from its very first days, before any formal killing infrastructure existed, before gas chambers were constructed, before any explicit extermination policy was applied to the camp specifically. It killed through deliberate deprivation, cold, starvation, disease, exhaustion. These were not incidental features of the camp's operation. They were its initial mechanism. The camp was initially designed to hold 50,000 prisoners. By the spring of 1942, those plans had been revised upward to 150,000. By later iterations, planners spoke of a capacity of 250,000. These numbers were always far beyond what the physical infrastructure could support. The gap between planned capacity and actual conditions was not an administrative oversight. It was the logic of a system that treated human beings as expendable inputs. Who ran this system? At its head in the early period was SS Obersturmbannführer Karl Otto Koch, the same Karl Otto Koch who had previously commanded Buchenwald, where his methods had earned him a reputation for extreme brutality, even by SS standards. Koch would eventually be removed from command and investigated by the SS itself, not for his crimes against prisoners, but for corruption and embezzlement of SS property. He was executed by the SS in 1945, one of the rare instances of the organization disciplining one of its own, though for entirely self-interested reasons. Below Koch, and eventually replacing him in functional authority, was a succession of commandants and deputy commanders whose names would appear decades later in war crimes proceedings. The bureaucratic structure of Majdanek mirrored that of other SS camps. A commandant at the top, a series of department heads responsible for labor, security, administration, and, eventually, the killing operations themselves. Every function was documented. Every transfer of prisoners was recorded. Every death, at least in the early period, was entered into a register. The camp was also, from the beginning, something unusual in the geography of Nazi atrocity. It was not hidden. Auschwitz was located in a remote area, screened from the nearest large city. Treblinka was deep in the forest. Majdanek sat in plain view of Lublin streets, separated from the civilian population by nothing more than a perimeter fence. Polish residents could see the watchtowers. They could see the smoke. They could see the columns of prisoners being marched to and from labor details. What they knew What they suspected and what they chose to believe varied, but there was no physical concealment. This visibility would later become historically significant in ways its designers never anticipated. When the camp was liberated, there was no question of denying its existence. The structures were there. The evidence was there. The proximity to a major city meant that thousands of civilians were potential witnesses to what had occurred. But in 1941 and 1942, that reckoning lay far in the future. For now, the camp was growing, and the population being sent to it was about to change dramatically. Spring 1942. The camp that began as a labor facility for Soviet POWs is undergoing a transformation that reflects the broader evolution of Nazi policy in occupied Poland. The Wannsee Conference has taken place in January. The formal coordination of the final solution, the systematic murder of European Jews, is now an administrative reality. In the Lublin district, Odilo Globoknik is overseeing the construction of the Operation Reinhard death camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These facilities are purpose-built killing centers designed to murder arriving victims within hours of their arrival and to leave no survivors. Majdanek is different. It is a concentration camp, not a pure extermination facility, but it is increasingly drawn into the orbit of the genocide being planned and implemented around it. Beginning in the spring of 1942, Jewish prisoners from the Lublin region begin arriving at Majdanek in significant numbers. They arrive alongside Soviet POWs, Polish political prisoners, and other categories of prisoners that the SS designates for internment. The camp is not yet operating as an extermination facility in the same sense as Belzec or Treblinka. It is not designed to kill all arrivals immediately. But the mortality rate among Jewish prisoners is catastrophic from the beginning. What kills them in this period is the familiar triad of the concentration camp system: starvation, disease, and violence. Food rations are calculated to sustain minimal labor while slowly degrading the physical condition of prisoners. The caloric intake provided at Majdanek in 1942 was, by the estimates of post-war investigators, insufficient to maintain body weight under even light work conditions. Under the heavy labor that most prisoners were assigned, construction, agriculture, industrial work for SS-affiliated enterprises. It produced rapid physical deterioration. Disease followed deprivation with terrible efficiency. The camp's sanitation infrastructure was inadequate from its first days of operation and never caught up with the expanding prisoner population. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis moved through the barracks with devastating speed. The camp's infirmary, such as it was, offered minimal medical care and was, in certain periods, more a place where the sick were separated and allowed to die than a functioning treatment facility. The Soviet POWs, who had been among the camp's first prisoners, were by this point dying at rates that appalled even some within the SS bureaucracy. Not from humanitarian concern, but because dead prisoners could not perform labor. Of the roughly 2,000 Soviet POWs documented as arriving at Majdanek in the autumn of 1941, only a small fraction survived to see 1942. The death rate in those first months approached and in some periods exceeded 80%. But it is in the summer of 1942 that Majdanek's function shifts in a way that places it in a distinct category among Nazi camps. This is when the killing infrastructure, the gas chambers, begins to be installed. The decision to equip Majdanek with gas chambers reflects both the camp's growing role in the broader genocide and a characteristic feature of the final solution, the industrialization of murder. Hand shootings, which had been the primary method of mass killing employed by the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front, were increasingly seen as inefficient and psychologically taxing for the perpetrators. The camps offered a more detached, more scalable method. At Majdanek, 2 initial gas chambers were constructed using carbon monoxide, the same agent used at the Operation Reinhard camps. A third chamber, added later, was equipped to use Zyklon B, the hydrogen cyanide compound most associated with Auschwitz. The construction of the gas chambers did not replace the other mechanisms of death already operating at Majdanek. It added to them. The camp continued to kill through starvation and disease. It continued to kill through violence and arbitrary execution, and it now also killed through systematic gassing, applied with particular intensity to prisoners judged unfit for labor. The sick, the elderly, children, and those selected in the periodic reviews of the prisoner population that SS doctors and administrators conducted with bureaucratic regularity. By the end of 1942, Majdanek had become something that did not fit neatly into the categories the post-war world would use to classify Nazi facilities. It was not only a concentration camp in the traditional sense, because it now possessed and used extermination infrastructure. It was not only a death camp because it maintained a large prisoner population performing forced labor over extended periods. It occupied a hybrid position, a killing facility that also worked people to death, a labor camp that also gassed selected prisoners. And this hybridity made it, in some respects, more representative of the Nazi system's totality than either category alone. The question of how many people it would eventually kill was still, in late 1942, unanswered. The machinery was in place. The population flows were established, and the worst was still ahead. Majdanek is now operating at the center of a regional killing system whose scope is expanding with every passing month. To understand how the camp functioned at the height of its operation, it is necessary to trace the experience of a prisoner from the moment of arrival. This is not an abstraction. It is the documented experience of hundreds of thousands of individual human beings, reconstructed from survivor testimony, SS records, and the physical evidence that remained when the camp was liberated. Prisoners arrived at Majdanek by train, typically in sealed cattle wagons that had been in transit for hours or days. The conditions inside: no water, no sanitation, insufficient air, killed people before the train reached its destination. The precise number who died in transit to Majdanek is not fully known, but accounts from survivors describe bodies among the living on every transport. At the unloading platform, arriving prisoners were subjected to their first selection. The process at Majdanek was not as formalized as the notorious ramp selection at Auschwitz-Birkenau, where arriving Jews were divided immediately and systematically between those who would live and those who would die. At Majdanek, the selection process varied by period and by the composition of the transport. In some periods, those judged fit for labor were registered into the camp. Those judged unfit were directed elsewhere. And elsewhere, for much of 1942 and 1943, meant the gas chambers, either at Majdanek itself or at the Operation Reinhard killing centers still operating nearby. Those admitted to the camp underwent a registration process that was, in its bureaucratic thoroughness, one of the most disturbing features of the entire system. Prisoners were photographed. They were given identifying numbers. Their personal possessions, clothing, valuables, documents, the ordinary objects of ordinary lives, were confiscated and inventoried. The scale of this confiscation would become evident when Soviet forces found the warehouses near the end of the war. Inside the camp, the prisoner population was divided into sections separated by barbed wire fences. There were separate compounds for men and women, and separate areas for different national and categorical groups. The internal hierarchy of the camp placed SS guards at the top, followed by a layer of prisoner functionaries, kapos, who were assigned authority over other prisoners and who, in many cases, enforced SS orders with a violence that reflected both the coercive structure they operated within and, in some instances, their own choices. The barracks themselves were wooden structures originally designed as horse stables. They were cold in winter, stifling in summer, and chronically overcrowded. Sleeping arrangements were tiered wooden bunks, several prisoners to a bunk, with insufficient blankets and no individual space. The sanitation facilities, latrines and washrooms, were shared among hundreds of prisoners and could not keep pace with the biological reality of that density. Work at Majdanek was organized through the camp's labor department, which assigned prisoners to a range of details: agriculture on the camp's farm, construction within and beyond the perimeter, manufacturing and workshops affiliated with the SS enterprises, and the maintenance functions that kept the camp itself operational. The hardest and most lethal assignments were those involving heavy physical labor under outdoor conditions during the Polish winter. Prisoners assigned to these details, without adequate food, without adequate clothing, without medical care when injured or ill, died within weeks. The gas chambers at Majdanek were located in a single building near the camp's perimeter. The structure contained multiple chambers, each equipped for a different killing method. The carbon monoxide chambers were connected to external tanks. Prisoners locked inside died from asphyxiation. The Zyklon B chamber, larger and added later in the camp's operation, functioned similarly to the chambers at Auschwitz. The crystalline pellets were introduced through roof openings, releasing hydrogen cyanide gas into the sealed interior. Survivors who worked in proximity to the gas chambers in the Sonderkommando details assigned to remove bodies described what they witnessed in testimony given after the war. Those accounts are restrained in the way that true trauma often is: precise about process, silent about the interior experience of bearing witness to what they saw. They speak of the speed of the process, how long it took, how bodies were arranged, how the chambers were cleared and prepared for the next group. They rarely speak of more than that, because there is no language adequate to more than that. After the gas chambers, the bodies were taken to the crematoria. Majdanek's crematorium, originally a single furnace, later expanded, operated continuously during the periods of highest killing activity. The ash and bone that the furnaces could not fully reduce were buried in pits near the camp's perimeter. These pits would be another element of the evidence that overwhelmed investigators when the camp was liberated. How many people were killed in the gas chambers at Majdanek? This question has generated significant historical debate, and the numbers have been revised downward from the initial Soviet estimates as more rigorous post-war scholarship has been applied to the available evidence. The current scholarly consensus, based on analysis of transport records, camp documents, and demographic evidence, estimates that between 60,000 and 80,000 people were killed in the gas chambers at Majdanek. The total death toll at the camp, including those killed by shooting, starvation, disease, and other means, are approximately 78,000 victims, with many historians settling around the lower end of that range as the most defensible figure based on available documentation. These numbers are contested. The SS destroyed significant portions of the camp's records before fleeing. The documentation that survived is incomplete. Reconstruction from transport records and survivor accounts is inherently imprecise. But even the most conservative estimates describe a facility that killed at a scale and with an efficiency that places it among the most destructive sites of the entire Nazi camp system. And the worst single day, the day that defines Majdanek's place in the history of the Holocaust, was still to come. November 3rd, 1943. The day begins before dawn. Across the Lublin district, SS and police units are in motion. They move not only toward Majdanek, but toward the nearby labor camps at Poniatowa and Trawniki, satellite facilities that hold tens of thousands of Jewish prisoners, most of them survivors of earlier waves of killing who have been kept alive because their labor was deemed economically useful. The operation they are executing has a name. The Germans call it Aktion Erntefest, Harvest Festival. The decision to conduct this operation emerged from a crisis that had been building throughout 1943. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April had demonstrated that Jewish prisoners, given the opportunity and the weapons, would resist. In the months that followed, there had been uprisings or attempted uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibor. The SS leadership in the general government had concluded that the remaining Jewish prisoner population, concentrated in the labor camps of the Lublin district, represented a security risk that outweighed their economic value. The solution they devised was total: kill everyone. At Majdanek, preparations had begun before November 3rd. Trenches, long, deep trenches, had been dug in the fields at the camp's edge. The purpose of these trenches was not concealment, it was efficiency. On the morning of November 3rd, the Jewish prisoners at Majdanek, approximately 18,000 people, were ordered out of their barracks and marched to the trenches. Loudspeakers were set up. They played music, waltzes, folk songs, in what the SS apparently intended as a measure to drown out the sounds of what was happening and to maintain some degree of order among the prisoners being assembled. The killing was done by shooting. It proceeded prisoner by prisoner throughout the day. SS units and their auxiliaries worked in shifts. At Trauniki and Poniatowa, the same process was carried out simultaneously. By the end of November 3rd, 1943, the SS had killed approximately 43,000 people across the three sites, the largest single-day mass murder in the entire history of the Holocaust. Non-Jewish prisoners at Majdanek were forced to observe. Some were assigned to work details that supported the operation. None who left accounts of that day described it without a kind of rupture in their testimony. A place where the language stops and the silence contains what cannot be said. The Aktion Erntefest did not mark the end of Majdanek's operation as a killing site. Jewish prisoners continued to be brought to the camp in smaller numbers in the months that followed. The gas chambers continued to operate. The crematoria continued to burn. But November 3rd, 1943 represents a threshold, not only in the history of Majdanek specifically, but in the history of what human beings have been capable of organizing and executing in a single day with bureaucratic precision and adequate personnel. The question that subsequent historians, prosecutors, and survivors would struggle with: how was this possible? What conditions made it possible? Who made the decisions and who carried them out? Does not have a single answer, but the record of what happened is clear. It happened. It was organized, and it was carried out across three sites within the span of a single autumn day. To speak of Majdanek in terms of operations and statistics is necessary. It is also insufficient. The camp held at various points in its history a population that included Soviet prisoners of war, Polish political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews from Poland, Slovakia, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and elsewhere, Jehovah's Witnesses, and members of other groups targeted by the Nazi state. Each arrived under different circumstances, carrying different expectations of what awaited them. Each experienced the camp's mechanisms in ways shaped by their assigned category, their physical condition, their skills, their luck, and the particular period during which they were interned. Survivor accounts of Majdanek share certain recurring elements. The cold is mentioned almost universally. The Polish winters experienced in insufficient clothing, in barracks that offered minimal insulation, on work details in open fields. The hunger is mentioned with the same frequency. The accounts describe the specific texture of deprivation, rations that consisted of thin soup and a small quantity of bread, the way the body changes under sustained underfeeding, the particular quality of attention that hunger produces, the way the mind narrows, how the simplest food becomes the dominant thought. The violence is described with a kind of careful distance that characterizes much Holocaust testimony. Survivors describe specific acts, specific perpetrators, specific moments. They describe the unpredictability of it, the way violence at Majdanek was not only systematic and institutional, but also personal and arbitrary. Individual guards beat individual prisoners, for reasons that had nothing to do with camp regulations and everything to do with the absolute power the SS structure placed in their hands. Among those who left the most detailed accounts of the camp is Eugenia Guz, a Polish Jewish survivor who arrived at Majdanek in 1942 and survived through a combination of circumstances that included her assignment to indoor work. Her testimony, preserved in the post-war documentation, describes the morning roll calls, appel, that required prisoners to stand for hours in all weather conditions while guards counted and recounted the prisoner population. She describes the particular horror of watching the selections, the moment when a guard's gesture determined who would be pulled from a work detail and directed toward the gas chambers. She describes the way that prisoners learned to move through the camp, the particular walk, the avoidance of eye contact, the management of visibility that constituted survival knowledge in that environment. Children were present at Majdanek throughout its operation. Some arrived with their families, some arrived alone, separated from parents at earlier stages of the deportation process. The documentary record on the fate of children at Majdanek is fragmentary, partly because the SS was less consistent in documenting the deaths of children than the deaths of adult prisoners, and partly because children were among those most frequently directed toward the gas chambers rather than registered into the camp's formal prisoner population. What the record does show is that children were present, that some survived through concealment or through the protection of adult prisoners, and that most did not. Among the figures who would later bear witness to what Majdanek represented was the writer and journalist Konstantin Simonov, who entered the camp with Soviet forces in July 1944 and wrote one of the first accounts of what he found there. His description of the warehouse containing the prisoners' shoes, the image that would become, in the decades after the war, one of the most potent symbols of the Holocaust, captures something that statistical accounts cannot: the weight of ordinary objects rendered extraordinary by context. Shoes, he wrote, were piled from floor to ceiling. Children's shoes, most of them, and among the shoes he found something else: small toys, dolls, objects that children had carried with them on the transports, clutched through the journey, still present in the warehouse where they had been separated from their owners. These objects remained in the warehouse because the war ended before the SS could process and redistribute them, as they had distributed the clothing, the valuables, the hair, and the other physical remains of the murdered, fed into the economic machinery of the Reich. The shoes at Majdanek are still there. In the decades since liberation, a memorial has been established at the site. The original barracks, the gas chambers, the crematoria, all of it preserved, maintained, open to visitors who come to see what was built there and to understand, as clearly as any physical site can convey, what it was used for. Who were the men and women who ran Majdanek? The question is important, not because it produces surprising answers, but because the answers are, in their way, more disturbing than any alternative. The perpetrators of Majdanek were not, by and large, pathological outliers selected for their deviance. They were, in many cases, ordinary people. People who had families, who had professional careers before the war, who were capable of kindness in private life and systematic murder in their professional capacity. This is the conclusion that emerges from the most careful scholarship on the subject, and it does not make comfortable reading. It would be simpler if the people who operated the gas chambers at Majdanek, who conducted the selections, who organized the Aktion Erntefest, were identifiably different from the rest of humanity. The evidence suggests they were not. They were products of a specific institutional culture, a specific ideological framework, and a specific historical moment that created the conditions in which mass murder became not only possible, but routine. The camp's commandants, Karl Otto Koch, Max Kögel, Hermann Florstedt, Martin Weiss, and Arthur Liebehenschel, who commanded the camp in its final operational phase, were career SS officers whose professional advancement depended on the efficient management of a killing facility. Their individual characters varied. Some were known for exceptional brutality. Some were more restrained in their personal conduct, while fully complicit in the institutional killing. What they shared was participation in the same system. Below the commandants, the camp's guard force included both SS men assigned from Germany and auxiliary guards drawn from Soviet territories, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and other former Soviet subjects who had been recruited or coerced into SS auxiliary service and who staffed many of the day-to-day security functions of the camp. The role of these auxiliaries in the camp's killing operations has been documented in post-war testimony and trial records. It is a layer of the perpetrator story that adds complexity to the already complex picture of who participated in what happened at Majdanek. There were also, at Majdanek, women guards. The Aufseherinnen, female SS auxiliaries assigned to the women's sections of concentration camps, held positions of direct authority over female prisoners. Several of the Majdanek Aufseherinnen were later tried and convicted for their conduct at the camp. The most prominent of these proceedings, the Majdanek trials, took place in the 1940s and again in the 1970s and 1980s as West Germany undertook a series of prosecutions of surviving camp personnel. The Majdanek trial that began in Düsseldorf in 1975 was, at the time of its commencement, the longest criminal trial in German history. It examined the conduct of 16 defendants over the course of 6 years. The outcome was, by the measure of what had been committed, modest. Several defendants received prison sentences. Others were acquitted on procedural grounds. One defendant died during the proceedings. The sentences handed down did not approach what the scale of the crimes might have warranted. Some of the defendants were elderly by the time verdicts were delivered. Others expressed in testimony a combination of denial, minimization, and the claim that they had acted under orders. The same defense that had been rejected at Nuremberg and that the courts rejected again, with varying results, at Düsseldorf. What the Majdanek trials did accomplish was the creation of a detailed documentary record, testimony from survivors, from defendants, from witnesses, that supplemented and in some areas exceeded the evidence gathered at liberation. That record remains a primary source for historians of the camp and of the Holocaust more broadly. July 22, 1944. The first Soviet units reached the Majdanek perimeter. The SS guards have been gone for days. The evacuation of the camp began in mid-April 1944, when it became clear that the Soviet advance would eventually reach Lublin. Prisoners were transferred to other camps, primarily Auschwitz, in a series of transports that moved tens of thousands of people westward as the front advanced. Some prisoners died on these transfers. Others arrived at Auschwitz to face the selection process there. By the time Soviet forces entered Majdanek, the camp held approximately 1,000 prisoners, those who had been too sick or too weak to transfer, left behind when the last guards departed. These survivors were the first witnesses the outside world encountered, their physical condition documented without requiring any additional explanation, the nature of what the camp had been. The speed of the German retreat had left much of the camp's infrastructure intact. The gas chambers were intact, the crematoria were intact, the administrative buildings with their records were partially intact, and the warehouses, the enormous storage facilities where prisoner property had been sorted, catalogued, and held before being shipped back to Germany, were intact and full. Soviet investigators moved quickly to document what they found. Photographs were taken, measurements were recorded, survivor testimony was gathered. Soviet newsreel footage of the liberation was distributed internationally and shown in cinemas across the Allied world within weeks. The initial Soviet report on Majdanek, published in August 1944, estimated that 1.5 million people had been killed at the camp. This figure was almost certainly a significant overestimate, derived from calculations based on the capacity of the crematoria and the quantity of ash found in burial pits, without accounting for other variables that would complicate such calculations. Western journalists who covered the liberation were cautious about the numbers, not because they doubted that mass murder had occurred, which the physical evidence made unmistakable, but because the statistical claims seemed to some to exceed what could be rigorously supported. The debate over the numbers would continue for decades as historians applied increasingly sophisticated methods to the available documentary evidence, the revision of the death toll downward from the Soviet estimate. The current scholarly consensus settles on a total death toll of 78,000, with the most recent estimates toward the lower end. Does not diminish the nature of what occurred at Majdanek. It refines it. The revised numbers are not smaller because less happened. They are smaller because historical rigor requires that claims be supported by evidence, and the evidence, carefully analyzed, supports a specific range. What the liberation of Majdanek did in the summer of 1944 was provide the world with its first sustained physical confrontation with the reality of the Nazi camp system. Auschwitz would not be liberated until January 1945. The Operation Reinhard camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, had been dismantled and were no longer visible. Majdanek stood intact, close to a major city, photographed and filmed and described in the international press while the war was still ongoing. For that reason, it occupies a specific place in the history of the Holocaust's documentation. It was the first proof offered to a skeptical world in the middle of a conflict that the reports coming out of occupied Poland were not exaggerations. They were, if anything, understatements. In the decades since 1944, Majdanek has been preserved and maintained as a memorial and museum. It is one of the few sites of the Holocaust that exists, largely intact, in something close to its original form. Visitors who come to Majdanek today walk through the same gate the prisoners walked through. They walk through barracks that still stand. They pass the gas chamber building, still intact as it was when the Soviets arrived, and the crematorium. They can see the mausoleum built after the war to hold some of the ash excavated from the burial pits, a structure that contains, visibly and literally, the physical remains of people killed there. And they see the shoes, still in the warehouse, still piled as they were found, still carrying the weight of what they represent. The preservation of Majdanek is not without controversy. Questions of how to maintain such a site, how to interpret it for visitors, how to represent a history of this nature in a physical space. These are ongoing conversations among historians, memorial professionals, survivors and their descendants, and the Polish and Jewish communities most directly connected to the site's history. There is no single answer to how a site of mass murder should be preserved and presented. There is only the ongoing effort to ensure that what happened there remains known, and that the physical evidence continues to bear witness after all the human witnesses are gone. The last surviving prisoners who could speak from direct experience of Majdanek died in the early decades of the 21st century. Their testimony exists in archives, recorded, transcribed, preserved in institutions that have understood the urgency of documentation before the generational window closes entirely. But the living chain of memory that connects the events of 1941 through 1944 to the present is now broken, as it was always going to be. What remains is the historical record, the documents, the photographs, the physical site, and the question that Majdanek poses with particular force, because of its visibility, its proximity to a civilian population, its survival intact. About what it means for a society to permit something like this to exist within sight of an ordinary city, within knowledge of ordinary people living ordinary lives. The historians who have studied Majdanek most carefully do not offer simple answers to this question. Neither does the evidence. The Polish residents of Lublin who could see the watchtowers from the road were not, in the main, participants in what happened inside the perimeter. They were also not entirely without knowledge. What they did with that knowledge, or did not do, is a question that their descendants and the historians who study this period continue to examine. This is not a question unique to Lublin or to Poland or to the Second World War. It is a question about the relationship between knowledge and action, about what individuals within a system of organized atrocity can do and choose not to do, about the distance between seeing and bearing witness. It is a question that the 20th century posed with particular force, and that the 21st century has not yet finished answering. July 1944. Soviet soldiers stand at the edge of what has been, for 3 years, one of the most lethal places on Earth. They document what they find with the tools available to them: cameras, notebooks, forensic measurements. They record the dimensions of the gas chambers. They photograph the warehouses. They gather testimony from the survivors. They try, in the immediate aftermath of discovery, to do what the scale and nature of what they have found seems to require: to make it known, to make it undeniable. The history of Majdanek is, in part, the history of that effort and its complications. The initial disbelief, the debates over numbers, the trials that produced incomplete justice, the decades of scholarship that refined the historical record without diminishing the moral weight of what it describes. How bad was Majdanek? It was a place where human beings were worked to death, starved to death, shot to death, and gassed to death. Sometimes all four in sequence, as the camp's mechanisms and policies evolved over 3 years of operation. It was a place where the worst single day of mass murder in the history of the Holocaust occurred in November 1943, within sight of a Polish city, while music played. It was a place where 170,000 or more people, perhaps significantly more, the record is incomplete, were killed, and where the physical evidence of that killing was so thoroughly preserved that denial, in the immediate aftermath of liberation, required a willful refusal of what could be seen. The shoes in the warehouse at Majdanek are still there. They have been there for more than 80 years. They will be there, if the memorial is maintained, for the generations that follow, the generations for whom the war is not memory but history, and for whom sites like Majdanek carry the entire burden of making history feel, in some way, real. That burden, the burden of remembering what was done in a specific place to specific people in a specific period of history, does not diminish with time. If anything, it grows heavier as the living witnesses depart and the task of transmission falls entirely to the record they left behind. Majdanek was not the largest camp. It was not the camp that killed the most people, but it was the first one the world could see, intact and undeniable, with the war still ongoing. And what the world saw there, in the gas chambers, in the crematoria, in the warehouses full of the belongings of the dead, was a proof that changed the terms of what could be claimed to be unknown. It had all been known, and it could never again be claimed otherwise. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.